In this chapter, we're going to look at some examples and classifications of different joints found in the body, talk about how those joints are made and the movement that is allowed by each of those types of joints. So I guess first we need to understand what a joint is. So a joint, which you may also call an articulation or an arthrosis, is a point of contact between two or more bones, or between cartilage and bones, or between teeth and bones. The study of joints is called arthrology, and the study of the movement of joints is called kinesiology. So when we look at joints and how they're made, what their structure is, this helps us to classify joints. So we look to see, is there a joint cavity, a synovial cavity, and also what type of connective tissue is found as a part of that joint. Structurally, joints can be classified as fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. We also want to classify joints based on their function. So what do they do? What is the degree of movement that is permitted? Joints may be classified functionally as a synarthrosis, which is an immovable joint, an amphiarthrosis, which is partially movable, or a diarthrosis, which is a freely movable joint. Now you're going to see these terms again. I know you're thinking, oh my gosh, how do I spell these? We'll get to that. Hang on. Alright, so here's the movement of the joints as we were talking about with the function of these. So remember, a synarthrotic joint is one that allows no movement. So you find synarthrotic joints in the skull, where bone meets bone and they form sutures, or a gomphosis, which is the socket that your teeth sit in. So obviously these bones have very little movement, so the joints where bone meets bone has very little movement. Amphiarthrosis allow a little bit of movement, so the joints are not completely immovable, but we don't want a lot of movement in these. So for instance, where the front of your hip bones come together is called the pubic bone. So the two pubic bones meet there in the front, and of course they have a joint between them, and that is where we have this little fibrocartilaginous pad called the pubic symphysis. So it allows the hips to move slightly at that joint, but not much. And the same thing with the intervertebral disc. So these are the fibrocartilaginous discs that are found between the vertebrae. And we do have movement of the vertebral column, but very little movement between the individual vertebrae. And then the diarthrotic joints. These are the ones we commonly think of when we mention a joint casually. So these are the ones that allow for free movement, such as the hip, the knee, the shoulder, and the elbow. When we classify joints based on their structure, we're looking at how these joints are made, what holds these joints together. So fibrous joints are going to be made up of different types of tissues. So sutures have very, very dense fibrous connective tissue. Okay, remember we talked about sutures just a moment ago, and these are where the bones of the skull meet each other. Syndesmosis are more dense, so more dense fibrous connective tissue than a suture. So these allow for even less movement, and this is what you find with the ligament that's holding your teeth in the socket that they sit in. So that's an example of a gomphosis. And then we have a fibrous joint that is made of interosseous membranes. Wow, there's one of those words, right? Let's think about what that means. Inter means between. And what about osseous? You've heard osse before as we were talking about osseous tissue and bone, so that refers to bone. So membranes between the bones. So this is a broad sheet of connective fibrous tissue that is located between two bones, such as we have between the radius and the ulna, which are the two bones in the lower part of the arm. Also in structural classification, we look at the types of cartilage that make up these joints. So a synchondrosis is made up of hyaline cartilage and allows no movement. So this is such as we find at the epiphyseal plate. Now remember again, when we were talking about the structure of long bones, we talked about the shaft being the diaphysis and the ends being the epiphyses, and you had that cartilage that was between the two that made up the growth plate. So this is what we're talking about with that epiphyseal plate. It is a synchondrosis. A symphysis, as we mentioned a while ago, is also made up of cartilage, and your symphysis is going to allow for very limited movement, and an example of this, of course, is the pubic symphysis. And then our final structural classification of joints are the synovial joints. So synovial joints are going to have articulating cartilage at the end of long bones, and they have a cavity that's located between those two bones as well, and we'll look at the structures of those and some of the things that you find in those synovial joints. So you've got the articulating cartilage covering the ends, and that cartilage prevents friction between those bones. So you're going to have a lot of movement in your synovial joints. Think about the structure, right? So we've got that cartilage making it up, hips, knees, elbows, shoulders, but then going back to functional, you've got a lot of movement. So these are also going to be diarthrotic. All right, so let's look with a little bit more detail at the classification of these joints. Looking first at the fibrous joints, they will lack a synovial cavity, so they're not filled with that slippery synovial fluid. The articulating bones are held together with dense fibrous connective tissue, hence the name, fibrous, very little or no movement, and we see three different types of these: sutures, syndesmoses, and interosseous membranes. So let's look at an example of those. Here you have connective tissue fibers forming a suture between two of the bones of the skull. So obviously this is going to allow for very little movement. When we're looking at these bones in a lab, you'll see that what you really just see is sort of a line between these two bones. So if you get a cut and you have to go to the emergency room, they may suture the edges of that injury together. So think of that as just sort of sewing things together, and that's exactly what these little fibrous joints do with the bones of the skull, just sort of sew them together. Here you can see the interosseous membrane between the tibia and the fibula. So there's that interosseous membrane made up of fibrous connective tissue. And here you see a syndesmosis. Okay, so there's your tiny little, very, very short fibrous connective tissue ligaments that are holding that tooth into the socket. And here you see a tibiofibular ligament. Now remember, this was the interosseous membrane. Right down here you've got a syndesmosis that is just a tiny little short ligament between the fibula and the tibia. Alright, so this table will give you the same information, but rather than looking at it in a picture, you can look at it with structural classification and functional classification, along with a description and an example. So a suture, the articulating bones are held together by that dense irregular connective tissue. We find these in the skull. How are they function, or what is their functional classification? They're synarthrotic. Remember, synarthrotic means immovable, or amphiarthrotic, very, very slightly movable, and an example of this is the coronal suture, one of the sutures found in the skull. Structural classification of fibrous joints, syndesmosis. So articulating bones are united by even more dense irregular connective tissue, usually in the form of a ligament. Functionally, they're amphiarthrotic, slightly movable, and an example of this is that tiny little ligament we saw in the previous picture, that distal end at the tibia and the fibula, so the tibiofibular joint. An interosseous membrane, remember this was the sheet of connective tissue, such as we found between the tibia and the fibula, and these are functionally amphiarthrotic in that they are slightly movable. Now let's continue to look at structural classifications and examine with a little more detail the cartilaginous joints. So cartilaginous joints will also lack a synovial cavity. The articulating cartilage are going to be between these bones that are found in this joint. It's going to prevent or allow very little movement or no movement, but it provides a surface so that bone doesn't rub against bone, so that those articulating bones can move across each other with little friction. We further classify these into two different categories of cartilaginous joints, a synchondrosis and the symphysis. So looking at these, structural classification, description, and function with examples. Synchondrosis, the connecting material is made up of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is going to cover the ends of these bones. This allows for slight or no movement. So these joints are either going to be amphiarthrotic or synarthrotic. An example of this is between the very first rib and the manubrium, or the upper part of your sternum. We also have symphyses, I guess would be the plural, of cartilaginous joints. So that tells us what the structure is. We have a connecting material that's sort of a flat, broad disc of fibrocartilage. So this allows for slight movement, which we call amphiarthrosis, and we have this as our examples, the pubic symphysis and the intervertebral disc. And then remember the epiphyseal cartilage that we mentioned a bit ago, the hyaline cartilage, which is located between the epiphyses and the diaphyses of long bones. It's not really a joint, but it is where bone meets bone, and there's cartilage between that. But because that is immovable, it is synarthrotic, and again we find these in the long bones between the epiphyses and the diaphyses. Here you can see the examples of this. Here you've got those epiphyseal plates made up of that hyaline cartilage. Here is the pubic symphysis, okay, so that's a symphysis, and here you have the synchondrosis between the manubrium, the upper part of the sternum, and that first rib. Synovial joints have a cavity, a synovial or joint cavity between the articulating bones, and they're freely movable. Remember, we described that a while ago as being diarthrotic. So we've got this cavity surrounding the joint. It's going to be filled with synovial fluid, so the articulating bones are held together with articular cartilage. We've got lots of ligaments and the synovial fluid, or the liquidy stuff that's in the joint, very rich nerve and blood supply, and all of this is surrounded by something called the articular cartilage, or articular capsule, excuse me. So we've got a lot of movement. We've got the cartilage helping to absorb some of the shock of these joints, because we do move these joints around a lot. So the capsule surrounds the joint and unites the bones that make up the joint. The capsule, let's just go ahead and move to the next slide. Here you can see the capsule around the joint. Okay, so we're looking at one of the synovial joints within a finger. So you've got the capsule surrounding the joint and sort of holding these bones together. Okay, now that capsule is made up of an outer fibrous layer, which may also contain some ligaments, and the inner synovial membrane, you can see here, that is going to secrete synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is very clear and really slippery, syn-ovy. Okay, ova refers to egg, syn means with, so it looks and feels very much like slippery egg white. So this is going to nourish the joint, the cells that make up the bone and the tissues of this joint, as well as provide some cushioning. So the flexibility of this capsule permits a lot of movement, but also it has great strength, so it helps to prevent these bones from dislocating in the joint, because remember, your synovial joints are very movable. So the synovial fluid secreted by the membrane lubricates, reduces friction, supplies nutrients, but also helps to remove waste products from the cells that make up the tissues in that joint, and to get it back into the bloodstream so we can get rid of the waste. Alright, so also a part of these synovial joints, we're going to have some accessory ligaments and little structures called menisci, which are little patty, sort of disc-like structures. they help to hold the bones together. The ligaments hold the bones together, and the menisci, which is plural of meniscus, help to sort of hold the joint in place. So it modifies the shape of the surface where the bones are meeting and helps that joint to maintain stability. And then we also, in our synovial joints, may have bursa. Bursa are just little fluid-filled bags, sort of sac-like structures that are found where one body part meets and moves over another. So it provides a bit of cushioning. If you have bursitis, itis means inflammation, so these bursa can become inflamed in joints where you have a lot of excessive movement, or if you're doing a repetitive motion of moving that joint, the bursa may become inflamed. And there are also tendon sheaths that are a part of some of the synovial joints. The tendon sheaths are like bursa that are tube-like in their structure, so they're going to wrap around tendons in areas where there's a considerable amount of friction, such as the tendon of the biceps brachii at the shoulder joint, and also some of the tendons associated with the wrist, again in areas where we have a lot of movement. These tendon sheaths can also become inflamed and cause painful movement of those joints.